Let's see. So, welcome to this very first AI Tech Week Amsterdam. There's a lot going on in terms of research, innovation, talent training, talent attraction, talent retainment, um, and startups around AI here in Amsterdam. So, we thought it would be a great idea to share some of this. And that's why we have a series of 4 meetups this week. The first one is today, and then we'll continue tomorrow, Wednesday, and then Thursday. And we'll cover each of these 4 themes that I just mentioned: research, training, talent, and innovation and applications. So today is devoted to research. We have 4 fantastic presentations coming up. The first presentation is a joint presentation by Hinda Haned, who's with Janssen Biologics in Leiden and with the University of Amsterdam, where she's one of the leaders of the Civic AI Lab. That it's a joint presentation by Hinda and Sara. Sara is also in the Civic AI Lab, and together they'll tell us more about algorithmic fairness in the wild. After that, we'll switch to another public-private lab in the Amsterdam ecosystem, the Elsevier Discovery Lab. That's a lab where Michael Cochet is the lab manager. Then we'll switch to Kees Snoek. He's not in 1 lab, not in 2 labs, but in 3 labs. If I can remember them off the top of my head, that's the Qualcomm lab, the Cuva lab with Qualcomm, the Atlas lab with TomTom, and AIM lab on AI for medical imaging. And then finally, Onno Zoeter, who will represent the all-new Mercury machine learning lab. That's a lab between Technical University Delft, University of Amsterdam, and Booking.com, where Onno is actually employed. So let's get going with our first lab. And our first presentation, by Hinda and Sara. So if you're ready, Hinda and Sara, let's get started.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
All right, let's do that. So I guess first thing to do is to share my screen. While you do that, I'm just going to introduce us very quickly. So indeed, Sara and I are part of the same lab. That's called the Civic AI Lab. We are situated at the University of Amsterdam. And our lab is focused on creating inclusive AI, so AI that is useful in society. And we're going to show you some examples of that. I'm particularly interested in explainable AI, while Sara is actually a PhD candidate in our lab working on fairness. And so we thought it would be a good idea to combine our forces to discuss algorithmic AI fairness in the wild being an industry setting. Since I'm also a lead data scientist at Janssen Biologics, which is a pharma company here in the Netherlands. And the idea is to kind of show you how practical some of the advice that we get in this space is and what it actually looks like in practice to deal with fairness. So for some reason I lost Sara, so I'm going to try and share my screen one last time. No, that's still not working. Sara, are you back?
Would you like to send me the slides and I can share my screen? Maybe that's...
Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, let me try this. Okay, you should see my slides now. Can you confirm?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, so let's work like this, and hopefully Sara will join us back again soon. So I think I can skip the intro. So this was about us. I'll leave it here for a second to also maybe place both of us in this presentation. And I wanted to say a few words about our lab. So the Civic AI Lab, these are our partners. So we are actually completely publicly funded. And we essentially position ourselves as an AI lab that is actively working towards contributing to a more engaging society where everyone has equal opportunity to participate and engage in a fair, transparent manner. And the way we kind of think about our research projects and all the work that we do in the lab is within this lens of really being inclusive towards everyone. So everybody should be benefiting from AI in the same way, and everybody should be given a chance to share their thoughts or their vision or their concerns about the AI systems that the lab is working on. And so how do we do that? Sarah, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, fantastic. So Sarah's going to take us through the lab's mission.
Yeah, so basically we at the lab, we want to develop AI that promotes economic and social human rights, and also at the same time to develop AI that advances inclusive and social cultural systems. So the way we do that is that we work with different, very diverse groups and organizations so that we get access and collect representative data in a way that all groups are represented in the same way. And we also employ socially grounded fairness measures so that we, to the best of our ability, are able to modify algorithms so that they include equality, equity, and take into account also the differences amongst these groups. Next slide.
Yes.
So how can algorithms help us in the city? So here at the lab, we have basically 7 projects, as you can see: health, education, environment, well-being, mobility, policy and governance, and ethics and law. I am personally in charge of the health project, where we use analytics to define, identify and design health algorithms that help the city, especially vulnerable children, and design algorithms that treat all the groups fairly. There's also the education project, which focuses on designing algorithms that help with school allocation, for example, or in general, educational resources in the city. If you have any questions about the lab, by the way, you can go to the website or you can contact us.
Yep. All right, so we clearly think in our lab that AI can be useful, especially to contribute to a more inclusive society, but we also are aware, as you may be as well, that AI algorithms can also fail. And one way we like to kind of bring up the story about algorithms failing is by showing some of these news items that can appear quite regularly in the press. And there are probably more recent ones recently, but this kind of shows that often we hear about failures of AI when it causes harm. So it's already being deployed, it's already affecting users or customers or citizens, and then we hear about issues in terms of discrimination or harm that is caused by an AI-driven system that once deployed, actually folks are going to start realizing that it's, for example, discriminating against a particular subpopulation. And this is often in the news. It's kind of US-centric, and we feel like it only happens in other places. It does happen in the Netherlands as well. It happens in Europe as well. And if you pay attention a little bit more to what's going on in that space, you see that there are things that affect us every day. So, for example, welfare allocation in the Netherlands, or even now more increasingly, banks are in the Netherlands are relying on our data and our interaction with their services in order to decide, for example, whether we should get a mortgage or not. And whether they are using a black box model to do that, it's not an information we have access to. So this is definitely something that touches all of us in our day-to-day lives. So now Sarah's going to take us towards trying to understand more, why does this happen? Why do algorithms fail?
Yeah, now that we have established that basically yes, algorithms can indeed fail, we're wondering why. And here I would like to refer to a quote from my New York Times article. As we know, algorithms are created and maintained by people, and they're created based on data that reflects people's behavior. So when using historical data or potentially biased data, we could even reinforce or exacerbate human prejudice or historical human behavior that we do not necessarily wish to, basically reinforce or have it be perpetuated. And I would like to take you to a quick example from Amazon Prime, which we can all relate to. Amazon made a corporate decision in the US to exclude certain neighborhoods from its same-day prime delivery system, which it was announced a few years ago. So their decision relied upon whether particular zip codes had enough prime members, whether they had proximity to a warehouse, and also whether they had access to enough delivery personnel. So of course, the combination of these factors was very much in line with the company's profit model. The implementation of this algorithm and decisions resulted in the exclusion of poor and predominantly African-American neighborhoods, transforming these data into basically proxies for racial classification. So these results, even if unintended, discriminated against racial and ethnic minorities who were not included, thus further segregating these groups. The good news is that following the publication of the story, the story was published on Bloomberg. Amazon rectified these decisions and included all neighborhoods in Boston, New York, and Chicago, and hopefully the other cities as well. So when we refer to bias, we talk basically about a systematic error that can perpetuate our unfair outcomes. But when can this bias happen? It typically depends on the data that we use to train the algorithm and or the choices that we make through the AI pipeline. And sometimes we even are unaware of this bias, and we don't find out until the harm has already happened, like in the Amazon Prime case. So if we don't act and adapt certain mitigating strategies in a timely manner, these algorithms could even magnify the harm and on the most vulnerable, less represented groups in our society, which again, like in the Amazon Prime example, just segregates these communities away from the advantaged classes and creates a disadvantage. Even, it makes it even bigger. And I like to assume that this is the opposite of the original intention. So you heard me mention the algorithmic pipeline. This is a very simplified model of the pipeline that illustrates basically where bias happens. And there are several other steps, but basically you start with collecting the data from a population, and then you build a model using the data, and then this model informs a decision. So the fact of the matter is that widespread algorithmic literacy is crucial for mitigating bias. So all the parties involved should be informed. And given the increased use of algorithmics models in daily life, then all potential subjects of automated decisions would certainly benefit from understanding the process and where the decision came from. Now, I would like to take you through another quick example. Now, imagine you're trying to design an algorithm that helps detect melanoma. Now, let's say, hypothetically, you get your data from Google Images. So if you perform a very quick search with the keywords melanoma or skin cancer, and be aware that the images might not be pleasant, you will essentially get search results of skin cancer on white skin. So if you keep scrolling down, and well, you have to keep scrolling for quite a while until you find images of melanoma on darker skin. Now imagine you use this data to train an algorithm that will be used in a clinical setting as a decision aid. Well, let's say in the city of Amsterdam. How could this tool be responsibly used on a population that is not 100% Caucasian, and a population that is not fully represented in the images? And the sad part of the story is that you'd be surprised how often this happens.
All right, so how can we avoid bias? Let me give you an example of how we're trying to avoid bias very often in I would say, an industry/company setting. So I've highlighted the model testing part because realistically, when you're a data scientist, this is where you actually have influence. You don't often have influence on what data comes into your model because you're going to use the proxies that you have in order to answer the business question at hand. And typically what a lot of data scientists do is do a lot of testing. So testing if the data sets have imbalances, especially if you have personal data being involved, then you can identify subgroups. So you're trying to figure out if the outcomes of your model are different across groups. And you can try and use a fairness measure in order to decide whether the groups are having similar outcomes or favorable outcomes. And we also try to understand the model behavior once it's deployed and monitor the predictions once they are actually really being serviced through whatever interface you have with your customer. So that's great in practice. So it's great in theory, I want to say, and actually not in practice, because typically monitoring models once they are deployed is almost a separate task for data scientists. And it's not always possible in an industry setting to actually get the necessary support to do that. And you can see how that's problematic, because we know how bias can actually be revealed once it's deployed. But if we don't actively monitor the user feedback before something really bad happens, which is the case in some of the examples that we showed you, then you're actually not really doing a good job at making sure that you're not developing biased models. But again, in practice, it's very complicated to do that. And I want to tell you a little bit about other limitations we face in the industry setting. Often we talk about bias and fairness across groups, but it is often not possible to get hold of those sensitive attributes to do the testing that you want for your model because of regulation constraints. And you don't have the ground truth available, so you don't necessarily know what a positive outcome is. And even if you would be able to perform a fairness intervention, which basically means changing the outcome of your model in order to have a more favorable outcome towards a particular group, it's very complicated to monitor that over time, because again, monitoring models in the wild takes a lot of effort. And the last thing I want to mention is that often stakeholders' goals, so the business owners, the folks that are actually ordering you or asking you to develop these models, they're not necessarily aware of fairness or bias issues, and it's often not their immediate goal. So when that happens, you kind of finding yourself in a situation where you're aware of bias and fairness or harm that your models can generate, but you don't necessarily have the power to do something about it. And this is something that we wanted to kind of mention today in our presentation. So now I'll give it to Sara to tell us more about her perspective on how do we mitigate this bias issue.
Yeah, so from the researcher perspective, what is fundamentally behind these bias, fairness, and accuracy trade-offs that we have been discussing is that there should be open conversations around ethical frameworks and practical guidelines and maybe even checklists for algorithms. And there are several ongoing and recent efforts to develop ethical frameworks and governance standards. For example, the EU recently released the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, and they highlight several principles such as you can see here, human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, etc. These principles interpret fairness through the lenses of equal access, inclusive design process, and equal treatment. With everything sounds great, it sounds ideal. Yet, even with these governmental and academic efforts, it is surprisingly difficult to define and measure fairness. That is practically what my entire PhD project is about, and I'm just focusing on one tiny little aspect of health in Amsterdam. Now, once we reach fully ethical and responsible algorithm design, hopefully in the near future, we might avoid the consequences of unethical applications that amplify discrimination, for example. But the truth of the matter is that we're not there yet, and we have a long way to go. And that's why it's so important to keep the conversation open throughout the pipeline and openly discuss these trade-offs, and maybe even take a step back and consider all our options.
And to close, I want to show a list of questions that I routinely share with stakeholders and business owners I have to work with when it comes to deciding whether we should trust a model or we should actually work with a third-party vendor, for example. And it's very simple, but it's just incredibly powerful in just starting the right conversations with these folks that have a say in whether you should continue a project, start a project, or whether you should really pay attention to fairness and potential for harm for the models you develop it. And these 4 questions I've been using now for a couple of years, and to me, they're always helping me raise awareness. So the first question, I'm going to go through them quickly, is do you actually need AI for this task? Is it really worth the potential harms that could happen if we're not having things under control? The second question is the system transparent? That also pushes people to define transparency. So what do you consider to be an acceptably transparent system? When and how does the system fail? So do we have enough information about the potential issues that we might face in the model or in the models? And who is responsible for the errors? And usually this is the one that freaks people out, because they realize that they are about to use very complex models that they're not necessarily comfortable with to make important decisions. So this is just a simple guide to folks who work in industry to kind of try and raise awareness around these issues. And I wanted to finish very quickly with this quote that I think is very relevant still today. And again, I've been giving talks about fairness for a little while now, but it's always a bit, to me, a bit surprising that we're not considering the context in which these AI, real machine learning systems tend to be deployed. Like, we don't really consider the full context in which they're being deployed, and that they might affect actual real people. And those people are going to increasingly become you and I, right? It's not going to be just folks on the margin of society like we like to see or we see in the media. It's simply folks that are using a service from the government, for example. And this is essentially how we wanted to finish our talk. So thanks everyone for listening, and be happy to take any questions you have.
All right. Thank you so much, Hinda and Sara. And wonderful timekeeping. So we haven't.
We tried.
And you succeeded. We have some questions in the chat, so let's start with those. And I have some questions myself as well. But in the meantime, I encourage everyone to share further questions in the chat. So
I just wanted to interrupt very quickly to say that if whoever would like to ask their questions directly on stage, please click the button Share Audio and Video, and then we'll let you on and you can ask your questions directly to our speakers.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask TX's question first. So what other outcomes can biases have beside discrimination? So that was actually a question that came up fairly early in your conversation or in your presentation. So I hope you're able to situate that in your narrative somewhere.
Well, I can give you one example, like unfair allocation of resources. That's not necessarily discriminating on the basis of, you know, the usual culprits, ethnicity or race or gender, but just unfair allocation of resources, maybe based on characteristics such as zip code or proximity, or providing equal access to transportation options, for example. There's so many resources that an algorithm can help with the allocation services, but you need to hopefully try to make sure that you are doing this in a fair way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can add to that something that's not really, I don't think we could call that discrimination, but I've seen it being called reduced quality of service. So essentially you're, for example, on an e-commerce platform and you get in, you know, because the system knows about your gender or your previous habits or purchases, they're going to make some assumptions about you that are completely off and put you in a group where you don't belong and just show you completely random stuff. So this doesn't necessarily happen to subgroups or women versus men, etc. It just happens because the algorithm is picking up on stuff that it shouldn't, and essentially it reduces your quality of service. Another thing I'm thinking of, and that's because I've worked for retail in a while, is those automatic checkout things that you have in the supermarket where you can check out things yourself. And then you get selected by an associate in the store to get checked whether you stole something or not. That is incredibly annoying to me when it happens to me, because I'm thinking, why is this happening to me? So I know there is an algorithm behind it that triggers that alarm, and then the associate comes to you. So it's not discrimination, right? But it is a reduced quality of service. And it might tend to happen more often to you because you buy a particular type of product or combination of product. So to me, that's not, you know, it's almost, it's kind of anecdotal, but it's still something that is an undesired outcome or effect of the algorithm that's being used.
Okay, thank you, Sara and Hinda. I'm going to read out Wessel's question. To what extent do you consider justice, fairness, and other philosophical concepts as unambiguous or determinedly, especially considering your ambition to tweak models in order to obtain specific outcomes the researchers deem appropriate. Right, so
Yeah.
these are complex concepts, and how do you optimize?
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Wait, I read it first, and when you read it the second time, Maarten, I got it. Thank you so much for the question. So I can maybe quickly answer I would say from my perspective, I think that they're far from being unambiguous, and I think it's an ongoing conversation. And I always answer to these type of questions as we won't necessarily know how to optimize for fairness in a model, but it is very important to at least have that conversation, because you then have a more transparent attitude towards what you're developing, and that also allows in return a more easy or a feasible recourse. So if the customer isn't happy, if your client isn't happy, you have a way of picking that up. Because you have been thinking about fairness and have tried to think about how to limit the harm or potential harm of your model. So I hope that answers your question.
I'm waiting for a second here.
Yeah, if there is a reaction. Otherwise, you join us on stage. I don't know how much time we have left for the conversation, but
can I quickly answer from my perspective?
Please go ahead, Sarah.
So it is unambiguous. It is ambiguous, all these concepts, and it's also such a new field of research that everything is getting defined as we speak, and there are several definitions of fairness, and it can get quite confusing sometimes. But I think once we realize what is our real purpose behind the algorithm, we can more easily grasp and understand who we're supposed to be serving. So once we keep that in mind and have it at the center of the purpose of what we're doing, I think it should be a tiny bit easier to define these measures. But I don't think it's ever going to be perfect. But I think it is a good thing that we're trying to make algorithms fair, because this wasn't happening 10 years ago.
All right. I have another question here on my screen by Nava. Hi, Hinda. How do you respond to answers which justify the use of AI on the basis of improved performance, often based on a limited set of metrics, at the cost of transparency? Do you try to explain that this is not a universal trade-off, or do you take a different approach?
That's a difficult one, but I like it a lot. Thanks so much, Nava, for asking your question. So typically, if I find myself in that situation, I try to raise awareness as much as possible. So I'm usually the person in the room saying, this might increase our sales, or this might help us get the product to market more, faster. But this is the potential harm. This is what it could do. So which one would you like to see in the newspapers tomorrow? Would you like to see that we have discriminated against this entire subpopulation in the Netherlands, or would you like to really focus only on the good stuff? And which one do you think the press is going to pick up? And usually that's a good argument to have people, slow down a little bit and think about it. But you also have situations where your client or your business partner is mainly interested in immediate gains and doesn't really think about long term. And that is something you have to deal with, and you have to feel, if you have that privilege, to be able to see if you kind of are comfortable with that. I know I wasn't comfortable with some of these situations in the past in my career, and I simply withdrawn from those projects or, left the company because that didn't feel like my values aligned anymore. But I think it's a very difficult one. But I think that the first step would be to already raise awareness, to have that conversation, which I think in itself is a huge step forward. To even have a stakeholder tell you, what about fairness? Should we care about this? That's for me a huge step that we should all try and establish before we really, make a decision about whether we should build AI for something.
Okay, I want to follow up quickly on this, and then I want to go back to Wessel, who has a follow-up comment in response to your answer to his earlier question. Let me check the time. Okay, we're good. So your first response, Hinda, was a bit reasoning from fear. I was anticipating a more of a risk-based answer. So in some cases, you can take risks. And in some cases, the risks are completely unacceptable, right? And what harm would you do if you recommend the wrong song? versus what harm would you do in the medical setting, or in the sharing of public resources setting, right? So these are different. To me, they feel like very qualitatively very different settings, and one way one could think about trying to disentangle the story, the narrative a bit, would be in terms of risks that you're taking, that you're willing to take. Yes, this starts with awareness and discussions, but I think I would also like us to move forward and go from the awareness to mechanisms and instruments. And risk, to me, is a sensible concept in this setting.
Yeah, I think the story that I was telling was going towards that, right? It's asking folks that are making the decisions, is this a risk that you're willing to take, and informing them of what could potentially happen in different scenarios. And this is what you usually do, whether you're working on something, that will involve personal data and will have some impact on individuals, or you're really working on something a bit more general and doesn't really have potential to cause harm. Sometimes even in situations where you're not using personal data, you'll have stakeholders that are very sensitive to this and would want to have like an audit or something very thorough analysis of the risks. It really depends on who you're dealing with. And I think it's very, stakeholder dependent. And that's why I think indeed, Maarten, whoever works in this type of setting should try and or should be ready to explain and raise awareness in the different type of outcomes that could arise from deploying a particular technology or model. It really depends, I think, and that would be my general answer, because I've experienced both types of stakeholders. To me, it's important that data scientists bring this to the table. It's not going to necessarily come from legal departments or ethical compliance folks. It's part of, I really believe it's part of what we should be doing.
Okay, thanks, Hinda. I want to speed up a tiny bit so as to come back to Wessel's follow-up comment. Do you actually need concepts like fairness? Let's take the breast cancer example. If it only shows Caucasian women, it is clearly not representative in light of a general health goal. Then a methodological vocabulary suffices to discuss the matter, and you don't need to add a layer of complexity that arguably invites, in his words, not mine, unnecessary political or philosophical debates.
Yeah, I wish all the use cases or all the things we deal with in the industry setting were that clear cut, right? Like you don't have enough representativity and you can show those very clear pictures and make the case. Often it's way more nuanced and complex than that. Often you do have representation. It's not the right type of representation. And you sometimes you don't know that it's not the right type of representation, especially in the light of what Sara mentioned earlier, that was also kind of a developing field, and we don't necessarily know. But indeed, if we're clear-cut case that way, like you definitely don't need to discuss fairness for hours. I think it's very clear where the outcome could be in that case.
All right, I'm going to leave it at this. Thank you so much, Sara, Hinda.
Thank you.
And all the folks in the audience who asked questions. Thanks again.
Yes, thanks a lot, everyone.